Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled The War of Silent Stars. The cubs had never known kindness. They cried when she first spoke their names. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The first body they found had no mouth. It lay curled beside a broken door of carbon glass, hands around its throat as if trying to cradle a sound that would never come. Beyond the shattered frame, the station's main corridor ran like a vein gone empty, lights dimmed, oxygen thin, dust drifting where laughter used to. Somewhere a bulkhead sang with stress, the metal's cry swallowed before it became a noise. Captain Mara Ellen stood in the doorway, visor open, breath slow. She didn't step past the body. She had learned 2 wars ago that grief would stalk a soldier to the exact footprint where they first chose to ignore it. She let the grief arrive and sit with her like an old wolf that smelled the same as it had in childhood, like smoke, like rain on copper. "Captain." Lieutenant Caro's voice came ghost quiet, the kind of whisper you made in a cathedral. Bio readings ahead, faint, multiple small. "Children," she nodded. The squad behind her shifted, the soft discipline of a crew keeping fear folded inside their suits. Their ship, Solace, hung outside the station like a held breath, the thin bone white of a patrol frigate built to find miners lost to malfunctions, not to exhume civilizations. But this was OSHA Prime's anchor, and its anchorage was now a mausoleum. For 6 months, everything around the star had been silent. They called it the Great Mute because that's what humans did when faced with something ancient and patient. They named it. They told themselves a label was a leash. Mara didn't believe in leashes, or gods, or lucky stars. She believed in hands. She believed in looking long enough that the dark admitted it had a shape. She believed in names and in saying them aloud. "Lanterns," she said. The squad's helmets pulsed a low gold. Shadows retreated like animals from fire. They moved down the hall. The sound of their boots was wrong, too soft, not muffled by atmosphere, stolen by something else. Every step felt like a secret. They found the cubs in the comms annex, behind a door welded shut from the outside. Caro cut the seal with careful arcs. The door lunged open on an exhale of cold air, and the smell that rushed out was old gauze, metal, exhaustion. 6 small bodies huddled under a collapsed console, a tangle of thin limbs and silver-gray fur. Their eyes reflected the lantern light like coins at the bottom of a well, wide and unblinking. They did not make a sound, not a whimper, not a breath. "Non-human," whispered Doc Juno, even though the helmets damped everything. "Metabolic profile, slow, starved. They must have been in here for days." Mara crouched, the plates of her knees kissing the floor. The cubs flinched as one creature. The smallest tried to bury its head in the crook of another's elbow, but the movement was clumsy, like a memory learned wrong. Mara extended her gloved hand, palm up. Her voice came soft, the way she used to speak in the backyard of a house eaten by vines, when fireflies drifted up like sparks from a forge. "We're not here to hurt you." They stared. Their eyes held too much calculation, fear, an animal's bright intelligence trapped in a room where cruelty had been common. She realized then that they had been waiting to see if she would be the next shape of pain. She swallowed and tried again. "I am Mara." The smallest one's gaze slid to her mouth, studied the movement of her lips. It leaned forward just a little. Only then did she notice. Its mouth was there, but not open, not able to open. Fine metallic threads crisscrossed the soft flesh where lips should part. 100 hair-thin stitches fused to the skin like frost. The others had the same lattice work. She could see the faint glow in the metals, a residual energy that told her the sutures had been adaptive, constricting as tissue tried to heal around them. Someone had caged their voices with wire. The smallest made a sound like air trying to remember. It pressed its face against Mara's glove. The metal mesh scraped. Its eyes closed. It did not cry, not yet. "Doc," Mara said, and the word felt like a prayer. "Get them to medbay, now." They carried the cubs out wrapped in thermal sheets. The station's silence watched them pass. When Solace broke away from OSHA Prime's shadow, the comms were already dying. Transmission windows stuttered and then went flat. The AI reported back a series of echoes that predated the words being spoken, as if the ship was talking to itself in a mirror that showed tomorrow. Night after night, the cubs woke without a sound. Their eyes would open wide, their hands would clutch at the air, but no noise left their throats. It was like watching someone drown in a lake with a glass surface, every plea visible, none audible. Mara slept on the floor of the medbay the first night because the old wolf had put its head in her lap and would not move. In the second hour, the ship's power flicked and settled. In the third, Doc Juno began to remove the stitches. They worked for a long time. The threads had barbed hooks so microscopic you could bleed without knowing why. Juno took them out with a patience Mara envied. On the third cub, the mesh loosened and fell away in a small glittering heap. Juno's hands shook. The cub's chest hitched, it swallowed. Tremors carried through its frame in waves. Then the sound came. It wasn't a voice, not yet. It was the animal ancestor of a voice, a raw, unbroken rush of need. A sob like discovery. The sound of a creature who had grown in a garden without wind, feeling it for the first time. The medbay froze. The cub startled itself with that first noise and tried to bite it back, as if afraid the air would punish it for being loud. Mara leaned close. Her hand hovered above its shoulder, not touching, learned lesson, earned care. "It's okay," she said, and the cub's eyes jumped to her mouth again, following every syllable like a trail in snow. "It's okay. You're safe." The cub's mouth shaped the echo of her okay without meaning, as if language was a kind of dance. It tried again and found only breath. Juno removed the last of the wire and sat down on the floor like a person with a heavy pack suddenly set aside. The cub blinked, felt its mouth like a new limb, and then, very, very quietly, it cried. That was how Mara met them, not with handshakes, not with flags, but with tears. They cried with the small, swallowed gasps of creatures who had never been allowed to make noise. They cried together, and the room let them. The old wolf lifted its head and listened like a witness. When the smallest had enough breath, Mara spoke gently, like she was teaching the dark to keep a promise. "Do you have a name?" The cub's pupils widened. It made a broken consonant. It shaped air around a vowel like a shell around a pearl. It held its breath, terrified of failing. Mara did not wait for it to guess at its own sound. She did what grandmothers did in kitchens at 2 a.m. She did what soldiers did on battlefields at dawn when one hand held bleeding and the other held hope. She named. "Your name," she said, and her voice was steady in a way the ship's hull could not be, "is Tavi." The cub inhaled sharply. Its hand pressed to its chest like a key checking if it still fit the lock. Its mouth opened. There was a pause, and then softly, the first self it had ever been sailed out into the air. Ta, Roman 6. It startled itself into a laugh that was almost a cough, then clapped its hand over its mouth as if to catch the laugh before it caused trouble. Mara took the hand away and held it. "It's yours," she whispered. "Keep it." She moved to the next cub and the next. Each time the same ceremony, the same miracle, the same terror that faded to awe. Leo, Ressa, Finn, Sari, Ket. They were not human names. They were names that fit in a mouth like small suns. When she said them, the ship changed. Caro watched the sensor stack blink awake with a frown that became a grin and then something close to tears. Captain background readings rising. EM noise, external signal variance, it's like something's letting go. Or loosening, Doc Juno murmured, like a tourniquet. The AI analyzed the shifts. The silence around OSHA Prime was not a vacuum. It was an active artifact, the choir field. A layered geometry of acoustic suppression woven across space like a net thrown over a lake. There were resonant seams. There were knots. names threaded through them like needles. The cubs slept that night with their mouths open, soft breaths like the first rain the walls had heard in months. The next morning, Solace's long-range transmitters reached command for 3 minutes and 41 seconds before the field tightened again. In those minutes, the human voice did what it had always done. It told the truth fast. The reply arrived as a burst pattern, compressed and brittle at the edges. A flag, a warning, a map. 2 words repeated in a redundancy spiral so tight the AI flinched. Vethari Choir. The files that unpacked next were old, older than Mara by 2 lifetimes, older than the last war by a generation. The Vethari had been a rumor in the archives of dead civilizations. Their buildings had not fallen. They had been erased as if by an eraser with immaculate fingers. The absence left behind was tidier than destruction. Historians wrote about Vethari with the careful contempt reserved for poets trying to describe a smell. They were not a species, the files said. They were a doctrine that had learned to build bodies for itself, bodies that changed according to the environment it ate. Their god was silence, but not the contemplative type. The kind you could weaponize, the kind that cracked empires without rubble, the kind that took a child's laughter and made it into a tool. Mara studied the map. Choir fields, invisible geographies, spidered across 5 nearby systems with filaments reaching out like the fingers of a hand placing a palm firmly over a mouth. The cubs sat together on the medbay floor and learned how to be noisy. They practiced on the smallest tool every soldier carried, rhythm. Caro drummed 2 fingers against the deck. Soft, soft, loud. The cubs watched like astrophysicists, eyes tracking, minds assembling a theory of the universe where pattern meant safety. Tavi went last and got it wrong on purpose, smiling like a thief. Mara laughed and startled herself with the sound. It filled the room like a tide. That was when the choir sang back. It came from outside the hull like weather. A pressure. A shifting of expectation, message squeezed into a shape too exact to be accident. The ship translated it into something that wasn't a tone and wasn't a word and wasn't a hand on the back of your neck. It was the impression of a calm voice saying, "Children." Doc Juno swore softly, the word a candle to hold against a hurricane. Another pressure like a breath on the skin just before a blade arrives. Return what is ours. The cubs huddled into each other. Tavi's ears flattened. Caro's hands found the console and held its edge the way a person held the railing of a bridge. Mara stood, her voice didn't change. If anything, it got quieter like a person closing a window on a storm. "They're not yours." The hull vibrated, a subtle tightening like a jaw. "They are quiet, they belong to us. They are not quiet anymore. Silence is not empty, it is waiting." The Vethari realized they were speaking to a human who understood that. The next pressure carried a weight of patience that frightened her more than rage. "You will be quiet." "Not today." The field tightened. The air in Mara's lungs felt 3 degrees colder. Somewhere, in the thin gaps between frequencies where human instruments feared to look, something vast rearranged itself. The ship's lights dimmed to a patient blue. The AI reported power variances like a heart watching a wolf approach. In the armory, the weapons array looked like a row of teeth that knew they were statues. Solace was not built for a sermon delivered at the muzzle of a gun. It was built to carry lost things home. But humans have a habit of making instruments into weapons when they must, flutes into knives, books into barricades, breathing into battle plans. Caro and Juno and a dozen exhausted, brilliant engineers took the long throat of the communications array and turned it into a cannon. They called it the voice. To fire the voice, you needed a chorus. The cubs, they were a chorus. Mara asked Tavi if he wanted to help. She asked with all her words in all their shapes because consent isn't a word you whisper when the wind is loud. It's a bridge you build brick by brick with the person who must cross. Tavi listened. He looked at the others. Their gazes touched like fingertips. "We sing," he asked, the sentence dewy with new grammar, "if you choose." He searched her face as if it were a sky with hidden constellations. Hurts, she nodded, a little. Hurts like metal, he touched his lips, the memory of wire a ghost beneath his skin. No, she said, and something old in her cracked like river ice. It hurts like being brave. They sang. At first it was thin. The choir field tugged at the notes like a tide tugging at a pier, pull, pull, until the cubs' throats trembled. Mara sang, too, not because her voice had power. It had the careful tiredness of a soldier who hummed to herself in hallways to make sure she hadn't turned to stone, but because children should not have to be the only ones making noise in a war built to punish them for it. The voice canon translated all of it, their breath, their names, the scrape of their nails on the deck into a geometry set against a geometry, a lattice built to loosen the tightened knots. Outside, Osha Prime's sky shifted from glass to air. Clouds formed where there had been only the idea of water. The planet exhaled like a sleeper coming back from too deep. The Vethari didn't scream, they adjusted. A new field fell like a second curtain. Their patience had limits, and it arrived carrying knives. The first Vethari ship rose from the far side of the planet like a stone pulled by a thread. It wasn't a shape a human mind wanted to hold. You could look at it only in segments, the edge like oil, the center like a mouth not made for any animal with honest teeth. It didn't reflect light. It insisted that light had been a rumor. It moved like a decision already made. Range, Mara asked. Caro's lips were bloodless, within our shadow. The voice's capacitors were full, the cubs drew breath, the Vethari sang first. If you've ever been told to be silent so hard you forgot your name, you know the feeling. Their weapon was not a blade moving through a body. It was a quiet moving through noise, wiping it clean. The ship's hum disappeared. The shuffle of boots on deck canceled itself. The very idea of friction stepped back. Mara's own heartbeat went still enough that she wondered if it had given itself away. For a terrifying second, she thought of her mother at a kitchen sink, washing a glass until it turned invisible. Then the glass would slip and shatter, because there's only so much you can erase before reality chooses to remind you it has edges. Tavi, she said, and the name cut a window in the dark. He sang. He knew 4 songs. A fragment Juno hummed by accident, a cadence Caro drummed, a lullaby none of them recognized that had been carried in his bones from a world whose oceans had new names, and the newest song of all his own. The first note cracked, the second held. By the third, his voice steadied on a root he didn't know he had. The other cubs answered. Finn's voice had a tremble in it like light on a blade. Ressa's was a line drawn through rain. Sari's sounded like sand remembering wind. Ket's was the ridge note that lets a chord feel like home. Leo's came late because he had cried first and hardest, and sometimes tears are expensive. Mara sang the names, not just the cubs, the dead she had carried, the alive she still hoped to carry. She said them like a spell and like a toll paid willingly. The voice canon turned their small human and not human courage into math. It met the Vethari's field and didn't shatter. It parted it like a hand pushing cloth aside. The Vethari ship twitched. You can't call it a flinch. But if you've ever seen a predator notice that a prey animal has a horn you didn't list in the anatomy book, you know the motion. Again, Mara whispered. They sang again. The field fought back. The deck groaned, the kind of sound a person would make if they believed sound still had permission. The cubs' throats bled a little, not from wounds but from the strain of being their own selves in a universe that wanted them edited. Tavi's voice went thin and hot. Mara felt the glass in the sink begin to slip. She had chosen this, and she would not let children pay her debt. Route auxiliary, she said, from life support. Caro's head snapped. Captain, we can breathe thin for 10 minutes. Juno closed his eyes, then nodded. We can breathe thin. The voice took the breath of the ship and turned it into force. Outside, space learned the word no in a language not spoken by a mouth. The Vethari ship's hull rippled. A seam opened like an eye trying to remember light. The choir field trembled around Osha's limb. Push, Mara said. In war, there's a moment when the thing you're fighting resolves from an idea into a body. You see where to put your hands. You feel what will break if you apply steadiness there, and there, and there. The Vethari weren't used to being bodies. They were uncomfortable in the shape. Their song wavered. The voice reached a frequency it had not been built to hold. The console's edges sprouted cracks like frost. Caro's fingers jumped from the controls as heat spilled. The deck under Tavi's bare feet vibrated until he could feel his name resonating in his bones. He smiled. It hurt. He sang harder. The Vethari screamed without sound. The scree of their field snapped inward. The ship arched like a spine that had never bowed. Then the seam tore. The first Vethari ship came apart like a concept abandoned. Nothing exploded. It unwent. It became the idea of a ship sitting in an empty chair, and then it stood up and left the room. Silence fell, the natural kind. The space after noise kind. The held breath turning to exhale. The cubs collapsed in a loose heap of relief and exhaustion. Mara's vision went white at the edges for a second. The ship recalibrated air and the thinness lifted like a veil. For a heartbeat they had one. Then 10 more ships rose. There are kinds of tiredness that lie behind your eyes permanently after certain moments. Mara felt a new tenant move in. She didn't look away. Caro, she said, the lieutenant already knew. Power at 62%, voice capacitors refilling, field realigning. They learned, Captain, it's going to be worse. Good, she said, and Tavi blinked at the word. We will teach too. They fought, and time stopped being something measured by clocks. It became a line of faces she would not let the dark take. It became Tavi's voice raw as dawn. It became Caro's hands blistered at the console because he refused to wear gloves. He needed to feel the machine like a pulse. It became Doc Juno whispering something to the AI that sounded like a prayer and a threat at once. Ships unwent. 4, 6, 8. The 9th howled in a frequency that turned Mara's molars to glass and then cracked them. She tasted iron and turned it into a note. Between the 9th and the 10th, the field spoke with that calm, horrible patience, Captain Mara Ellen. She felt the old wolf lift its head. You will be quiet. I can't, she said, and it was true in a way the Vethari would never understand. There was a child on a medbay floor whose first laugh had been a cough. There was a woman who had picked up a glass in a kitchen and learned gentleness the hard way. There were graves under 3 sons with names on them. I have work. The 10th ship opened its throat and the field collapsed inward like a fist. The voice could not meet it. The capacitors were a garden after winter. Caro threw heat at it like rope. Juno tried something with the ground and the sky swapped places for a flicker. It was not enough. The fist kept closing. Mara looked at the cubs. Some choices are math. Some are liturgy. She had spent half her life learning the difference. This one belonged to the old words. Caro, she said quietly, take command. His head whipped around in the silence after the word. No, listen to me. She kept her eyes on Tavi so she wouldn't say something easy. You will take the Solace and everyone in it and you will run. You will turn this ship into a trumpet and you will tell whoever is listening that there is a way to loosen the knots. You will say their names. You will not let the dark become polite again. Captain, Tavi. She softened the ship's intercom with her mouth like a hand over a speaking wound. Come here. He came unsteady, eyes too large in a face that had learned to be small. She crouched and met him where he was. I need to ask you one more thing. He nodded already, but she asked anyway, because consent is only a bridge if you keep laying planks even when the river roars. Will you trust me? He looked at the cable bundles, the cracked console, the metal that hummed like a throat clearing. He looked at his friends, at Ressa's trembling fingers, at Ket's stubborn mouth. He looked at Mara's hands, which were scarred in the way of hands that had learned to be gentle late. Yes, he said. She tried to smile and found she had to be honest instead. This will hurt. Hurt like brave, hurt like giving, swallowed and nodded like a soldier older than his bones. Juno, she said, Prep the pod. The pod was not a lifeboat. The pod was not an escape. It was a frequency anchor built to seed a field, a core that could hold a song past the throat that sang it, the seed of a star inside a glass apple. It would take a note and make it into air. It needed a carrier. Mara strapped herself in with hands that remembered tying shoes for a child who had now been dust for 9 years. It wasn't noble what she felt. It was housekeeping. It was what you did to keep the living room of a universe fit for laughter later. Caro's eyes went wet and bright like a metal on the edge of melt. There are other ways. There aren't, she said, and it wasn't cruelty. It was a small, hard thing given honestly. There are other days, choose them. Tavi climbed onto the pod's lip, small hands careful on the ridges. He pressed his forehead to hers the way his species had likely done at doors and bedsides for millennia. He smelled like metal and sleep. She spoke into that small space between their skin. I will go into the field and I will sing the way you taught me. The pod will make it big enough to matter. You will listen and you will answer, and together we will make them hear. He shook, then stilled, then nodded. Home, he whispered. Yes, she said, and every lie she had ever told herself about war fell away. Home. Caro's hand slammed a sequence that would have been poetry if he weren't weeping. The pod sealed. Juno adjusted the angle to prioritize the wound they had found in the field. The AI asked for permission to write Captain Mara Ellen into the registry of the quiet. She denied it. Names were for those who could hear them. Launch, she said. The pod went, and the ship lit up like a struck match. The field grabbed her immediately, a pressure, a drag, a command. It told her to stop being. It told her to become tidy. She had never been tidy. She was a woman who left books open on tables as if they were friends napping. She was a mother who still kept a small shoe in a drawer. She was a captain who swore at bulkheads and apologized later. She was an orchestra of flaws and truths. The field could not file her away. The pod unfolded its core. The voice connected across the umbilical of the in-between. She drew breath that was not air and sang. Her voice had never been lovely. It didn't matter. She sang the names again, and now she added more. The names of planets that had not had sound in too long, the names of rivers that had been called other things before some empire had renamed them, the names of her crew, each one a bell. The field struck back and she bent like a reed in a flood. The pod groaned and glowed and did not burst. It caught her note and turned it into rope. On Solace, Tavi answered. The cubs gathered around the console like monks around a hearth and gave what they had left. Their voices met the rope, and the rope became a bridge. Caro turned the ship itself into a throat. Juno synced cadence to hull resonance. The AI sacrificed the last of the backup humor files, which had been terrible anyway, to free power for the array. The voice met the Vethari's great patience and wore at it like a tide wears at stone. Patience is not a wall. It is a habit. Habits break. One by one, the 10 new ships learned to ungo. Mara sang until her chest felt hollowed, until the old wolf lay down beside her and put its head on her lap and said nothing because what could it say, until the pod cracked hairline fractures and then held. The field shook itself like an animal waking. For the first time since Osha Prime had learned quiet, it made a noise. It was a long, low grief. It was a surrender by inches and a promise new wants to make. She saw the seam. She put her hands there with her voice. She pushed. The seam tore open like a sky at morning. Sound fell into the system like rain. Every tower on Osha Prime that had held a breath too long exhaled. Every ocean remembered it was never still. The bodies in the station stopped being sculptures and became again what they had been, witnesses, lovers, makers. People whose mouths had been taken now returned to them in whatever future would be built. Mara's voice went out. The pod's math finished the sentence for her. The field gave way. Caro watched the graphs flatten and then sing. He whispered a word like a person touches a door and finds it unlocked. Captain. Juno said nothing. He looked at the medbay wall, at a scuff Tavi had made with his heel, and cried in relief so quiet it was another kind of roar. Tavi's song dwindled. He lowered his head and felt the echo of Mara's voice travel through him like a bird deciding which branch to leave. "Home," he said again, softly, turning the word into a wish and then into a command. On a screen above the console, the pod blinked a signal. It was small, the way a candle is small in a cathedral and still warms a room. Caro didn't look away from it for a long time. The Vethari retreated. Withdrawal isn't the right word, they loosened. They admitted, without using sound, that sound had a place. Their doctrine didn't break, it learned a limit. That is enough sometimes to save a world. The cubs slept for 2 days. When they woke, Tavi asked for water and then asked for a story and then asked if stories hurt. Mara would have answered the last best, but Caro did his best. He told them about rivers on Earth that made a sound like coins in a pocket when they ran over certain stones. He told them about train stations where the air is a language. He told them about his mother's hands. They began rebuilding in the hours between griefs. Osha Prime wasn't empty. It was waiting for a voice to say its name again. Humans came like people come to a house that needs mending. Ladders on shoulders, nails in mouth, jokes for nerves. The cubs helped in ways only children can. They tried and failed and tried again, and their failures made the work bearable. They made a ceremony for the dead. It wasn't a funeral. It was a sound. They stood in the main bay where the voice still smelled like heat, and they spoke aloud the names of every body they had found in the station, and the names of every person the cubs could remember before their metal mouths. The names were stones in a wall that would not be moved by doctrine again. They took the pod home. It had burned itself down to a blossom of metal that looked like a flower pressed in a book. There were no remains to bury because the field had taken what it could and the voice had taken the rest. The empty was not empty, it was full of what she had given. Tavi pressed his palm against the metal. It was warm still, like a kettle after tea. He said the name, he said it like a seed. Mara. The others echoed. The room learned how to hold it. They built a platform on the station's main spine and placed the pod blossom upon it. Juno wrote a line under it with a welder and his careful hands. She kept the door open. Caro thought the sentence was insufficient. It was also exactly right. Good epitaphs fit on a breath. The Vethari watched from beyond the seam of the sky. They did not come closer. They would again somewhere. That's what habits do. But now there was a recipe, names, and the courage to say them. A canon that was not a canon. A choir that began in a mouth no longer wired shut. Word went out along the dark, and species old and young lifted their heads like deer in a forest hearing a sound that meant safety once. Some could not be saved. Some would not want to be. But the rope had been thrown. The bridge had a first plank. The cubs grew. Tavi kept a scar along his upper lip where the wire had taught him what edges were. He touched it when he needed to remember that pain teaches and also lies. Ressa learned engineering like it was a music she had been humming all along. Ket argued for the joy of it, and then learned he could use his mouth to build more than arguments. Finn taught humans how to hear the spaces between notes. Sari taught them a dance where you stepped aside for others, and then were welcomed into their circles in turn. Leo laughed easily, which felt like a kind of revenge. They named their world Salasha because it felt honest to mix debt and home. An alliance formed there, not just between humans and the Cubs people, who called themselves the Oral, but between everyone who had ever been asked to swallow their voices and smile. They built something else, too. In the hollow of Osha's moon, in the shadow where ships once died, they carved a hall. Its doors had no locks. Its ceiling was low enough that you were reminded to bow when you entered, not to gods, but to each other. In the center, point by point, they placed small lights for every world the voice had loosened since. People came to see the lights and to speak into a place that would always answer back. On a quiet day 10 years later, A Vethari envoy appeared at the edge of Salasha's sky like a rumor that had learned to dress in daylight. They did not come close. They sent a message that was almost a sound. "We have learned you will not be quiet." Tavi stood on the station's spine where a blossom of metal had outlasted a storm. He had grown tall for his kind. His mouth had unlearned the habit of being small. He spoke into the sky without fear. "We will be gentle," he said. "We will not be quiet. It is possible to teach an old habit grace. It does not happen fast. It does not happen completely." The Vethari did not become friends, but they loosened again, and then again, like fingers remembering an unclenched position. Word got around more ways than one. Thieves learned there were now places you could bring small, frightened creatures, and those places would say their names and give them soup. Soldiers learned there were times to holster their weapons and lift their throats. Politicians learned that a microphone is only holy when it hands itself to the next mouth. There were new funerals. There were small joys that felt like stolen honey. There were fields of grain that made a sound like applause when wind crossed them. Sometimes late, Caro would climb to the platform and sit with his back against the pod blossom. He would talk aloud to the empty that was not empty. He would tell it how the day had gone, which pipe had been stubborn, which child had discovered that 2 spoons sound like a bell if you hit them exactly wrong, which star they would travel to tomorrow to loosen another knot. If he cried, the hall kept his tears like salt keeps a road safe in winter. The second time the Great Mute tried to close over a system, it was not here. It was a place far out where the maps had edges. The message reached Salasha as a shiver through the new choir. The Oral cubs were not cubs any longer. They had mouths that knew how to comfort and anger in equal measure. They launched with humans at their side, and when they arrived, they found a Vethari doctrine that had not yet learned limits. They loosened it. They wrote names in the air with their voices until the field flinched and then opened like a hand reluctant to let go of a coin. They taught a school. They built a kitchen. They sang in a small room together until the ship stopped being quiet by habit. In a back corridor of a rebuilt station, Tavi found a child with wire scars hugging his own throat like a boarder. Tavi sat on the floor and waited. After a while he said gently, "Do you want a name?" The child stared. He nodded. Tavi said a sound that bent like a river. The child took it. He cried. The river widened. War did not stop. It became a different thing, as if a monster had learned it could not use silence as a blade and reached instead for older weapons. The choir met those too. The voice changed shape, less cannon now, more compass. It found the seams in people instead of in the sky. It asked day after day, "Where does it hurt?" It answered day after day, "Here is a sound you can keep." You can measure a civilization by what it does with its pain. Humans tended to make art and jokes and kitchens. The Oral made names and small dances. Between them, they found a way to plant those things like crops. On the 20th anniversary of the day sound returned to Osha Prime. They held a celebration that felt like a quiet morning in a house where someone you love is still asleep in the next room. There were songs and there were moments of deep knot singing that felt not like the Vethari's quiet, but like the earth drawing breath between waves. Caro, white at the temples now, stood on the platform and told the story again. He did not make himself a hero. He was an honest man. He named the hero she had been and then used the rest of his time to name the ones who had been small and brave. Tavi spoke last. He didn't plan to. He wasn't a planner. He was a person who followed the instinct that a bridge could be built here across this gap if you started and hoped. He stepped up because he had felt the old wolf lean a little heavier near his knee, and he knew grief when it asked to be carried. "I want to say her name," he began, and the hall answered with a shiver of breath. "But I also want to say ours, all of ours, because she did not build the voice to make us quiet or to make us into one thing. She made it to give us back our mouths." He turned and touched the blossom of metal. It was cool now, a relic not because it was old but because it had been touched by so many hands that it remembered them all. She kept the door open, he said, reading Juno's line again as if it were new. We walked through, that's the story. He looked up at the sky beyond the ceiling, which he could not see but felt like a weight he had long made peace with. If the Vethari come again, we will sing again. If they send 10 ships or 100, we will wear their patience down with our love of being loud. If they ask us to be quiet, we will tell them to be gentle instead. If they refuse, we will teach them again. He paused. People held their breath the way you do when you want to hear a soft thing, not because you fear a loud one. And if you ever meet someone with a mouth that has learned to be small, he said, you will remember this, speak their name. Give them yours. Then listen to what the world becomes. In a far place in a time that felt like a dream that remembered being a memory, the Vethari tried to write a field over an ocean where whales had learned a new chorus. The whales answered with a low, vast song. Human ships arrived with their trumpets and their kitchens. The field held for a day and then learned manners. It's strange, maybe, that the war of silent stars ended not with a battle but with 1,000 small refusals. A teacher refusing to whisper a child's story only in private. A mother refusing to name her grief anything but what it was. A soldier refusing to give a doctrine the quiet it demanded to thrive. A boy with a wired mouth refusing to be tidy. It did not end at all, some would say. It became another thing. But all wars end when the thing that feeds them cannot find food. On a morning like any other, Caro woke to the sound of spoons on mugs, and he smiled because it meant tea. He walked the spine to the platform. Tavi was there, sitting with his back against the pod blossom. They were both quiet in the good way. The sky beyond the glass had learned to trust their noise. Do you think she hears any of this? Caro asked, not for the first time and not really wanting an answer. Tavi considered, head tilted, ears angling to catch a wind too high for instruments. If hearing means being changed by it, yes. Caro sighed and let something heavy move down through and out of him. Then she hears. They sat a while. When the alarm came, it was only a soft bell, not a shout. A ship arriving, not Vethari. A freighter with a broken laugh of a drive. Caro looked at Tavi and Tavi looked at Caro, and one of them said, kitchen, and the other said, hangar, and they both stood at the same time. They had work. People often try to find an ending to stories like this. They want the moment you can clap. They want the picture where the hero holds up a sword and someone writes the date underneath. They want a line to put on a coin. The line is this: when the sky asked us to be quiet, we said our names. And the sky, having never been spoken to so tenderly and so stubbornly at once, learned to listen. Years later, an old Oral woman with scars like silver threads took a child to the edge of a field where wheat made a sound like rain with a memory. The child had been found somewhere far away with a mouth wired shut, and the wires had been removed carefully, and now he stood there with hands like birds on a fence, unsure whether to fly. The woman knelt and made the earth level by being low. "Do you want a name?" she asked. He nodded. He was frightened of wanting. She saw and didn't look away. She said a sound, and the sound was perfect for him, and he took it, and the field bowed in the wind like an audience, and the sky, which had learned something, carried the sound to places where quiet had been a tyrant. In a room in a station in a system that had been a cemetery, a blossom of metal kept a heat only memory can make. There are things too large for endings. There are things that become weather. This was one. So when I tell you the story of the War of Silent Stars, I don't tell you how it ended. I tell you how it keeps beginning. At a door welded from the outside, at a kitchen sink, at a platform under a sky, at the edge of a field. I tell you that the cubs cried when she spoke their names because kindness can be painful after drought. I tell you they learned to cry louder and then to laugh, and that some days laughing was the bravest thing they could do. And I tell you the line we put on the coin we pass hand to hand whenever the dark leans close and asks us to tidy ourselves into nothing. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.